March is National Returning Citizens Month, fourth National Returning Citizens Conference, held Friday, April 5th and Saturday, April 6th. Conference will be held at the Renaissance Arlington Capitol View Hotel in Arlington, Virginia. This two-day national conference featuring dynamic speakers, awards gala, comedy, a march and prayer rally, April 5th and 6th, supported by the National Alliance of Faith and Justice and a host of reentry partners from across the country. That's Friday, April 5th and Saturday, April 6th at the Renaissance Arlington Capitol View Hotel in Arlington, Virginia. This two-day conference of celebration, information sharing, designed to inform, build coalitions, and create awareness of the issues related to reentry that disproportionately impacts the health and safety of African American communities. For more information, go to nrcc2024.org. That's nrcc2024.org. What's going on? What's going on?
Welcome to On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Rod Smith. Rod Smith is a poet, editor, and manager of Bridge Street Books in Washington, D.C. He's the editor of the Selective Letters of Robert Creeley with co-editors Peter Baker and Kaplan Harris. How are you doing today, Rod?
Good to see you.
Always good to see you. Rod, back on July 17, 2003, the poet Robert Creeley sent you an email. In that email, he discusses putting together a collection of his letters. And he said he wanted the letters to tell a story. What story does the book you edited with Baker and Harris tell?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, it was sad when we took on that project. We expected Bob to be around for a while, and he was gone within a couple of years. But I think it tells a story of a poet. I mean, that's what I was trying to do, and you get a sense in the book of everything a poet in our times does. Bob was a little unusual in that he was very in touch with people, but in the 50s and early 60s, he was away from the centers. He was not in New York. He would visit New York, he would visit San Francisco, but he, was in upstate. He was way outside, and then in France, and then Arizona, Nicaragua. He was all over the place, and that's why those letters are so long. He had plenty of time to write long letters.
That sounds funny. Well, Creeley died in 2005, and I was wondering what type of correspondence did you have with him between 2003 and 2005?
Not a lot, because at that point we were still just gathering materials.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few things, but I included that one in particular because it gave his ideas about the book. But I was expecting to have more conversation with him once we started choosing things and whether there were things we missed, that sort of thing. But yeah.
Well, how big a project is this, Rod? Because you're working with Peter Baker, you're working with Kaplan Harris. I was just wondering, did you break down? Well, just how big a task is this to do in terms of a person who's very prolific in terms of letter writing?
That's why I brought in a couple people. I'm sort of on the edge of the academy myself. I teach occasionally, but I brought in some people in the academy that had some experience with these kinds of things, and because I wasn't able to travel so much, they were the ones that went to the archives. They went to Connecticut, they went to Houston, that's the thing. I mean, when you're dealing with the letters from somebody, you have to go where those archives are, or write to them, or there's a lot of communication with archives involved, and I let them do a lot of that.
Yeah, good. When I looked at the book, I saw under acknowledgement. I said, okay, this is a lot of people here,
Yeah.
and then you just said it. I know, um, I was like saying, well, did Creeley keep copies of letters? But you're talking about you have to go to other people's collections to
Yeah,
find out, what works are there. So I
that was a
was
good thing about email.
right.
Email, he had those. We had
Hmm.
those. He would just dump his hard drive onto a disk and send it to Stanford that had his papers.
Well, that's a good point there, right? Because I like the idea of letter writing, okay? But it seems now that if, for example, and maybe Creeley's a good example of this to examine, that one would write a long letter and put a stamp on an envelope, but an email might be much shorter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's part of why the book seems to be heavy in the 50s because he's got more time to write long letters.
Right.
And that was more the style of communication at that point.
Mm,
But I think if you count the number,
mm,
even though the book seems to be, half, two-thirds even early, and it's foundational too, so that's part of why it would be more.
mm,
If you count the number, it's just the shorter communications because he's at that point, then he is now at Buffalo and he is
right.
traveling and he is Robert Creeley. And he
Hmm.
wasn't Robert Creeley, until 1962 or so when he's kind of took off with For Love
Mm.
and real success started to happen for him.
Well, let's have you sort of look to the future. I'm thinking of someone like yourself. I'm thinking of somebody like Rick Peabody, somebody that has a lot of correspondence or interaction with writers.
Mhm.
What's going to happen to, the literary letter, where, for example, it seems with Creeley we have a lot of stuff we can go back, we can look at how he's thinking, but in the future we may not have that for a well-known writer, just because they're just going to have that correspondence.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have email if those are kept by the person, I
Yeah,
suppose.
but they're going to be shorter, I mean, unless, I just can't see that with somebody writing a long, long letter, like, you got to put several stamps on the envelope, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the technology is changing and changing us. I mean, you had a period of time there where everybody had a blog post.
Right. Right. Well, let's go back a little bit for our listeners, Rodsmith, and talk briefly about Robert Creeley. I only met Creeley once, and that was I did a reading with him down in New Orleans with him and Mary Baraka. But Creeley is associated with the Black Mountain College in North Carolina in the 1950s. He edited the Black Mountain Review. Why is he an important American poet?
Well, he brought a sensibility into the and a possibility into poetry that comes out of William Carlos Williams, a sense of directness, a sense of a pared down vocabulary, but there's a complexity that he gets doing that really resonates with people and has um, brought poets to their work in a way that it changed the possibility of poetry. I think that's and he had this strong friendship with Charles Olson, with Robert Duncan, with many others. Their work is so different from his, though,
Hmm.
and it gives you a real. I'll just use the word again, possibility.
Right.
Uh, it makes me think of, say, the difference between Joyce and Beckett. Beckett's very pared down vocabulary. Joyce's the last thing you would call it is pared down.
Hmm.
So yeah, uh, and also just he was just a wonderful gentleman. He
Hmm.
was just somebody great to talk to, and also incredibly articulate.
Hmm.
You know about his and other people's work, and
Hmm.
Yeah.
You know, I like the fact that you mentioned William Carlos Williams, because I noticed, like, in the first letter, he's writing like, dear Dr. Williams, because he's requesting work. But by like a few letters later, dear Bill,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I looked at that, and you mentioned Duncans, you mentioned and Olson, but I felt that when I look at Creeley's work, it is similar to William Carlos Williams.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 I mean, there's more, maybe a little, well, there's angst in Williams too, but particularly in the 50s, there's an angst, a searching through difficulty,
Hmm.
um, in Creeley that is, I think, different from Williams. And uh, actually, Bob famously read particularly those 50s poems, with the line cut off. He would almost come to a complete stop. And that came from a misunderstanding of how Williams would read his poems. And then he learned, of course, that was not how Williams read his poems, but he kept that sense. And it was also affected by jazz,
Right.
by bebop. He was
Hmm.
huge on Bird and Bud Powell, etc.
Hmm. Right. Well, when I was reading these letters, I thought of you, Rocksmith, because some of the letters, even the one that the first one to William Carlos Williams, Creel's working on a magazine, and I think about you as Ariel, okay, I'm contacting somebody because I need their work and this and that, but
Mhm.
but it's a lot about, like, putting together a magazine, reading work, and so how much is that in terms of you, did you identify with Creeley in terms of, he's doing some of the same things that you're doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would even say it more generally. I think that is one of the main things that poets do in terms of creating in order to create a community or to feel a connection, to have a conversation. Um, that's one of the main ways to go about it, is to start a magazine, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
And even now you can do it on the web. It's even easier, you know.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
I remember Baraka one time, uh, at a reading, somebody asked him, "What should a young poet do?" You know, and he said, "Start a magazine." You know,
yeah, yeah, with him, and I was thinking
get
of
a
him and,
menu
yeah,
machine.
yeah, I think of him and Hetty Jones, with Youngin, so a couple of those magazines coming out of Greenwich Village,
Mhm.
important in terms of some of the first people that were published. But this, when you talk about, writers and starting a magazine and this sense of community, I think when we look at Creeley, it's a different type of community, because he has the Black Mountain College in North Carolina.
Mhm.
And it's not just writers, it's Buckminster Fuller, it's Cunningham the dancer, John Cage. Talk about that community, and then also talk about you as a writer, Rod Smith. How much are you influenced by, say, the visual arts or some of the futurists like Buckminster Fuller?
Well, I mean, Black Mountain, Bob was involved with Black Mountain at the very end, only a few years, and he wasn't, I think he was there maybe 2 semesters. He was there and left and came back one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think, people like Rauschenberg might have still been around. Maybe Cage visited there, but it was going downhill, and they were running out of steam at the same time that they had this incredible uh, faculty and group of students. Um, in terms of, well, I actually, Cage is another person that I'd like to do. I mean, I've published him, and I knew him a bit toward the end of his life, and he was very very important to me and very opening for me. I knew him in my late 20s, early 30s,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I want you to share some poems during our program with our listeners.
mhm,
But I felt that, in terms of proper appreciation of your work, we need to talk about, like, Creeley, we need to talk about Cage, we need to talk about Ashbery,
mhm.
because you come out of a certain a sense of poetic. If you were giving a talk on poetics, what would you be emphasizing to a student that in terms of, okay, I'm going to read this poem by Ashburn, I'm going to read one of my own poems. What do you need before you even approach my work?
When I teach, I tend to um, just encourage encourage the student to find their own way and to look at their own, to read widely and to work regularly and to find their own way. I'm not very good at sort of selling my way of looking at things.
Okay.
I don't think that's what I'm there to do. Let's put it that way. In terms of my own poetics, it's always changing because that's what interests me, you know, and it makes me think of this idea of there are two kinds of artists. One would be like a Rothko that finds their thing and does that.
Hmm.
And the other would be like Picasso that can't stay in any one place and is always recombining things and finding new things to bring in, finding ways to work they hadn't worked before, you know, doing ceramics instead of painting, for example, you know. And so I tend toward the other. I like to do something I hadn't done before in a way
Hmm.
that surprises me. Not that
Hmm.
you don't also get that with, you know, a Rothko or an Emily Dickinson.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about about labels. I don't want to project labels on you, but you know, I would look at some terms that you use when you describe Ariel magazine. We're saying, okay, I'm looking for avant-garde and experimental work. Well,
Mhm.
what's avant-garde? What's experimental? And then what happens in terms of if we say language poetry, we say certain. Do you, as Rod Smith, do you feel that okay, I'm aware of those labels, but I don't want to lock myself into
Mhm.
them?
Um, I mean, I think of avant-garde as a tradition coming out of Rimbaud and through Dada, and so it's a tradition of uh, it gets complex and I'm just trying to come up with good vocabulary for it. But it's a tradition, it's a sensibility that pushes against expectations. That is, and it also tends to be anti-authority.
Mm. Well, then I don't have it in front of me, but if you were to go back and look at some of the first people that you published in Ariel magazine,
Mm.
who were some of the names? Because you use the names, you're saying, okay, I'm looking as the editor of this publication, I'm looking for this type of work. So my question is, who were you publishing like in the first two issues?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. I mean,
I can't remember either. I was gonna, you know.
I published Ethelbert Miller.
You're right. And I'm still living. But that's a good example. I mean, I didn't think myself as being I mean, I think I met you down at DC Space, you know, something like that. And I oh no, I know what. You were starting the magazine and I was being generous.
Yeah,
That's what I was doing. But I didn't but I on a serious note, I didn't know. I mean, I think I met you in terms of friendship. I didn't know that you had a certain type of magazine you were putting out. You just said
yeah.
you're
I
doing
mean,
a
I think
magazine,
that
right?
evolved at the beginning. I was just seeing what was there.
Right,
I was out in Virginia. There's no internet, you know,
right,
so it was a way of being in contact with people that were actively writing.
right. I
And then
see.
as my sensibility and evolved, um, the magazine reflected that
Right.
more.
Well, talk about that sensibility evolving, and then I'm gonna have you read a poem. Um, that sounds nice, but that's is that you reading materials that you coming in contact with new people? Is there is there like a teacher or mentor that's saying, okay, my whole idea of what a poem can be is based on I read this book or I met this person.
Well, I mean, what was my, I mean, I read Creeley quite early on. Um, Probably the first, as many people, The Wasteland was a piece that sort of pulled me toward poetry. I like the mystery of piece. I think it still holds up.
Well, let's go back because you said something, Rod. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you said something that you saw yourself being outside academia. But I'm assuming that there must have been good teachers that you had that that just take you
Well, I
through
mean,
T.S. Eliot.
a key experience was I took a workshop with Douglas Messerly,
Oh,
who was then
okay.
working on that big anthology that he did from the other side of the century, and he would bring in poems from that and push them at us. Here, what do you think of this? Let's read
Mm-hmm.
this. Let's talk about this for a minute. And so that's where I had read Frank O'Hara, I had read Charles Olson, I had read Creeley, but I didn't know what else was happening. I didn't know what was contemporary. And
Mm-hmm.
that was something that opened, Ted Berrigan and Lynn Haginian and people like this that gave me a sense of, oh, this is an ongoing thing.
Right, and you joined that community.
Yeah, over
Right,
time.
right. Well, I have a copy here of your book, Deed, and in the end of the poem, the book, you have homage to Creeley.
Mhm.
Take us, I mean, I have the book, so I can see visually what's going on, happening on the page. But read these poems. I think there's five of them.
Mhm.
But also read and discuss them in terms, okay, what am I doing here?
Well, the poem, there's a poem by Jack Spicer called Homage to Creeley. And I basically just used Spicer's form. And you have the poem and then a line across the page and then a commentary on the poem, which is also part of the poem. Um, so I was just using his form. And so it is an homage to that poem, but it also, there's another poet who wrote homage to homage to homage to Creeley. But so this is homage to Creeley. Um, Poem for stingers. Nothing static is a syrup. Nothing is out of nowhere except syrup. Is syrup on a photograph trying to enter the picture? Syrup. Hurrah, hurrah. Syrup is a stage name for Drano. Too much Drano would burn the little boy's finger in the dike. This is likened to a stinger. This is a poem about a bug husk. The little boy's finger. Is it a stinger? Does the little boy go buzz, buzz? Wrong turnstile. Sorry, there's some noise back there. Hopefully it's not coming through here. Wrong turnstile. The perpendicular particulate and its official placemat replacement propel all the parts expelled to a pre-date. On this date, the not yet circles an abbreviation. The circles are now on the abbreviation. Maybe they always were. I don't know if this is about the weather. Weather is something that's outside. I love you. Circles in the hand can be stolen, but who can rob this weather of its own treasure? The last thread of love can be stripped away, but a naked circle covers all. Fools like circles in the Santa Fe morning light cannot be encircled because of the ever vigilant ACLU. What would you have me hide under silk and the glittering of jewels? Shadows are our friend. To discover the rabbit duck requires a certain amount of light. A rabbit can duck and does in the presence of predatory birds into shadow. This does not help the rabbit if the bird is an owl. Do owls ever feel happy? My guess is no. This might be about a short-term relationship I had. This might be about a short-term relationship I had shortly after my son missed a curve at midnight on a full moon. There is some reason to believe he was trying to miss a deer. In that poem, the rabbit duck is somewhat famous. When you look at, you see a rabbit, you look again, you see a duck. It's that that Wittgenstein and other, and also art critics have gone into at great length. And there is a moment at the end of that poem which is autobiographical. I had a son that I lost in a car wreck. The life of a dime. A dime does not think, this makes it, excuse me, the life of a dime. A dime does not think, this makes it enigmatic. The dime thinks, I do not think, this makes me enigmatic. A bad poet might then write, a penny for your thoughts. This would not be worth a dime. The erotic idea of a or the erotic dime is a dense eroticism of erotic longing, says the bread and circus thief to the analyst erotically. Old dimes are removed from circulation and treasured or melted down. Does this resemble consciousness? I still love you. In this last poem, there's a second part which I will include that wasn't included in the book. Pour la CGT. The CGT is the largest trade union in France, closely aligned with the Communist Party. We work too hard. We're too tired to fall in love. Therefore, we must overthrow the government. We work too hard. We're too tired to overthrow the government. Therefore, we must fall in love.
You're listening to Rod Smith reading from his book Deed, which was published in 2007 by the University of Iowa Press in Iowa City. Thank you for the reading of those poems, Rod. Looking at this this the poems that you read, um, I'm looking at the use of white space on the poem. There's a lot of separation, like double spaces between the lines, almost forcing the reader, if I'm reading it, to stop after one line and think about it. The same way, for example, if I'm looking at a painting, I'm going to look at it, stop, maybe step back and look at it again. Not a straight reading like how you read it, but I would read it much slower. But I find that listening to you recite the poem gives me a completely different understanding than when I was reading myself.
Good.
Is that a, how does that?
I mean, you're, I mean, I think everybody hears, sees, reads differently, but you're getting hopefully some of my intention as well as your own understanding. So you bring those two together for
Right,
the experience, right?
right.
Um,
And then there's a theme that runs through a lot of your work. There's this a sense of the theme of love seems
mm,
to be there. Now you mentioned in terms of one of the poems, which is very personal, and it's like the love of son. But I find that was one of the themes that even in the last poem you read, and I was wondering, that poem you read, the last poem that appeared in a French publication, and I was wondering who did the translation.
it was a group of people led by a terrific poet now passed named Emmanuel Ricard. It was a wonderful opportunity I had to go over there. They invited me over for this translation, and yeah, it was published in French as several, they did a little book of 20, 30 pages of my work. You know, it was a wonderful experience sitting around a table with people asking you endlessly about what did you mean by this, you know.
Well, that's what we're going to do in the second half of the program. I'm right. I'm going to take a little break here, and we'll get back to asking you these additional questions. My guest today on the margin is Rod Smith. He is a poet editor. He's also the manager of Bridge Street Books in Washington D.C. And we've been talking about the book that he edited with Peter Baker and Kaplan Harris, the selected letters of Robert Creeley. The show's on the margin. My name is Ethelbert Miller. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.
Greetings, family. The WPFW Programmers Association, in harmony with station management, presents WPFW Live, a series of events over the next 6 months in partnership with some of your favorite local venues. The goal is to re-engage the community through a remembering of the valued relationships forged, all pointing to a reimagination of our future. Our first WPFW Live event will be held Wednesday, April 3rd, 5 to 9 p.m. at 18th Street Lounge, 1230 9th Street Northwest. Meet some of your favorite local programmers, enjoy great music, and partake in good spirits. Music by DJ Rasan, Music Relief Radio, Kamal Harris, Beats, Bars, and Bangers, and featuring DJ Divine, Soulful House Sessions. Food by Chef Jerobi of Flavorful Influences. Tickets are $20 and available at Eventbrite by searching WPFW Live. For details, call 202-618-2110. WPFW, changing the world one live event at a time.
Okay, we're back on the margin with my guest, Rod Smith, poet and editor, Rod Smith. Rod, we were talking about Robert Creeley in the first half of the show, and I just want to continue with maybe one or two questions about Creeley and then have you read some of your own work. I remember when I was at Howard University, I was walking around the library and I was in the stacks and I came across volumes of correspondence between Charles Olson and Robert Creeley. I said, "Oh man, what is this? And who's the acquisition librarian?" But when I was looking at it, I found it amazing. And, you did these selected letters with Creeley. That collection of volume was like, I think they correspond for like 2 years of their correspondence. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah, it goes on. I mean, the Olson and Creeley hit it off, to say the least. They had a lot to say to each other, and they were working out their own ideas by writing to each other at a very important time in their development. And that friendship was very intensely important to both of them, I think.
and that's
And
why I wanted to ask you this last
I,
question. This last question was, when we think of Olson, immediately we're thinking of projective verse. And for our listeners, could you just give us a definition of that and what Charles Olson was trying to achieve?
his poems look on the page almost exactly as different from Creeley as possible. Creeley's poems tend to be short lined. A lot of them, most of them early on fit on one page. Olson was concerned with the long line and with the breath, and maybe it would come out of Whitman a bit, but his articulation of it is very different than Whitman. And so, his books tend to be big. He was a big man. There's an incredible picture of him palming a basketball with one hand, uh, and his hand basically, it makes it look like a baseball.
Hmm.
He was a force of nature. Let's say he brought a lot of poets along with him in his way of thinking about things.
You mentioned in your comments just then about this whole thing of breath.
Mhm.
And when I think of breath, I think of Allen Ginsberg, who's also had correspondence with Creeley. Is the breath more Olson or is it Ginsberg?
Well, I mean, you mean for Bob or for?
No, no, for when I remember Ginsberg was here a number of years ago, giving
Mm.
a workshop actually at the Institute for Policy Study, and that
Mm.
was one of the things he was emphasizing. This whole thing of breath,
Yeah.
and so he read a certain way, or actually he was like saying, this is how you can figure out where you break your lines.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I was just wondering, I associate that with Ginsberg and the Beats, but if I'm coming through the Black Mountain College, would I get it before that? Olson is talking about that before Ginsberg.
Well, how maybe I think they're both coming to it around the same time, but they're not yet in contact. I
Hmm.
don't
That's
think,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Huh. I mean,
I
that's
think
something to
there's
pursue,
one
really.
poem that turned on a generation to possibilities of poetry. It would be How. I
Yeah,
mean,
I remember in Baraka's memoir, he talks about like when he heard how it reinvented what poetry could do.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, um,
And there's a great poet that's
right.
turned on by.
Well, let's hear you howl, Rod. You can read some poems for us, and I selected, if you could read, actually you have some poems from Touche, which is another book of your collection of work,
Mhm,
and this was from Wave Books in Seattle. Uh,
mhm.
is if you could read Summer, we're in spring, but summer's coming, and you have a summer poem here.
Okay, summer poem. The artwork provides the sensuous idea of freedom. Bed goes up, bed goes down. Just the me to you. For clarity's sake, for a full length feature, or just orgasmic, like they say. I have now provided the sensuous idea of freedom. I'm very pleased you were able to attend.
I like that. You know, you have that, and I, I found Touche completely different from Deed,
Hmm.
in terms of that. And then the poem I was chuckling about was sort of like a list poem, this poem in your collection, Find the Job That's Right for You, which to me, coming through the pandemic, reads completely different now.
Yeah. Well, this is what we used to call a found poem, and that they called for a while a conceptual poem, and now I think people are back to calling it a found poem. This is actually just taken from the Andy Warhol Museum website. Find
Well,
the
that's
job,
good. That's good to know.
yeah. Find the job that's right for you. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was reading, so I just took took it and turned it into a poem. 3. Part-time program presenter, Sportsworks. 4. Part-time program presenter, Science Theaters. 5. Part-time custodian. 7. Part-time visitor services representative. 8. Part-time education program specialist. 23. Part-time gallery attendant. 69. Part-time program presenter, visitor experience. 115. Part-time program presenter, science on the road. 120. Part-time instructor. 134. Part-time art history instructor. 143. Occasional outreach presenter. 148. Part-time education program specialist, adult studios. 153. Part-time sales associate. 158. Part-time security officer, Oakland. 159. Part-time security officer, Carnegie Science Center. 160. Part-time security officer, Andy Warhol Museum. 168. Full-time security officer, Carnegie Science Center. 182. Part-time gallery ambassador. 183. Full-time lead skilled maintenance. 191. Part-time customer service representative. 195. Occasional art handler. 198. Executive assistant. 200. Part-time sales associate. 203. Full-time assistant curator of education. 205. Director of Powder Mill Nature Reserve. 206. Sales associate. 207. Part-time program presenter 1. 209. part-time program presenter, miniature railroad and villa. 212, full-time custodian foreman. 216, assistant director of finance and operations.
Listening to the poetry of Rod Smith. Well, I was laughing at that because in that list, there's only 3 full-time jobs,
Right.
which is the nature of work today. Like you can find part-time work, but you can't find any full-time work. You know? So that's very interesting. Why don't you share with our listeners Annette, which is on page 53.
Annette for love. Loud as is uncommon in this nowhere, the sky, half fire, half smoke, stops, but continues as a shining wall. Outside, they who never were, loud, unthought non existence, re aggravated by the nothing. Stupid one, your wall is all of this.
Okay, and let's hear 2 more poems. One I selected buoyancy, and then also you selected the love that is truly a refuge for all living beings. So let's hear those 2 poems, and if you could talk a little bit about um, buoyancy and also the poem you selected, the love that is truly a refuge for all living beings.
Buoyancy is um, my attempt at a confessional poem, I suppose, which is not the 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 aesthetic that I'm identified with. So, as I was saying, it always interests me to do something different. Well, let's see how this one.
How this one bounces.
Yeah, buoyancy. The light, then, the singing in the letters, which are gnats, which, if windy, see then the fool who comes to you and forgets to bring his joy, who thinks he will find it with you. Everything I have written is trash. I have not even the strength to love. Let it go. That's true, that is not true. Untrained tandem gnat brain, if you want the city and dying fish to be a touchstone, rub the indicator needle and a genie will appear, knitting. I'm sorry for saying I loved you when I've not really done that, but oh, I have in my foolish batter head, in my back too tight, the frog voice underneath. Everything, trash and strength, let it go, all of them. I am led and I am led when I should be salt, or else gum when I should be gunk. Go back to the drinking place, souls that snow, the quivering, obliged no more, at rest and joy. Soft is a world should perish, and the victory of the light. I Ching say he ends by achieving nothing. A real devotee, no? Invited from blank and obtained. Another bed for interrupting, perhaps the world's. You said you were the world. Well, maybe, because a calf thinks God is a cow. I have to write past this obsession with you, Nora, with an invalid admiration in the learning. You've got the idea. I'm a calf and the victory of the light. Does it go on? The poem, I mean, between tortoise and torture, you'll find and analyze a repetition fetish and accidental death, pretending we're supposed to recover. That's what the pills are for. That's not what the pills are for. The victory of the light, then, is gentle. I believe that. The love has almost destroyed me. So he begged a calf, yes, and a source of light, and a digestive tract. Since and the great friend found and alone, I am your mirror, here are the stones. That was stolen and no longer is. That's true, that is not true, and trash. Some things forgive, people always do, whether they die or not, eventually, somehow, opening. Your heart's bad, half of it. How come? My heart's horrendous, a thief book held wrong at 12, half love, poetry. is truly remarkable trash.
Poetry of Rod Smith reading from his book Touche. And so we'll have a last poem from your book D. And this is the love that is truly a refuge for all living beings.
Thermal deformation of the active element of a periodic mode like the previous moment of a ball of foam, but with regard to the sounds that were, so to speak, thrown away through the process of making other pieces like the sprout from a rotten seed, water music, impurity-induced self-trapping of holes, and minority ion percolation like the erection of a eunuch like antennas, and some were like interruptions of photoelectric cells. Living became something quite long that could be cut up. Stabilization of a stimulated, extended life emission like thoughts of avarice, immorality, wickedness, and hostility in a bodhisattva who has attained tolerance, photochemical or any other form of punctuation, the effect of the four refractive indices like the perception of color and one blind from birth, like the fun of games for one who wishes to die, like black body radiation when I whispered it and cadences became things, free of conceptualization and empirical luminescence discharge, the syllable passion spectra into the electric fanning halide laser of vast anomalous reactive tangent activities constructal alms. Properties of properties dent in welding this weak collision, eons of foci, tunable, coherent, immeasurable.
Thank you, Rod Smith. Now, I noticed something very interesting. I asked you to read a few poems, which you did, and then you said, "Oh, could I read this last poem?" And
Mm.
I noticed that the poems I selected are completely different from the one that you selected. And I was wondering, in terms of this was a reading. You're selecting your poem. You prefer this poem. You asked, I want to read this poem. What's the difference between like the ones I selected and the one that you just did? Was this like one of your favorite poems? This is a poem that you read often at readings,
This
or you?
one has interested me to read lately because I it's the ongoingness of it, it's the musicality of it that interests me, and also this use of scientific language toward a more to toward spirit,
Mhm.
um, trying to bring out that aspect of those concepts. Uh,
Visually, it's a completely different poem on the page from your other work that you have.
mhm.
It's much long. It's much more vertical.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just keeps going. It roll.
Hmm.
If I could, I would read it in one breath, but you can't do that.
Well, let's as we move towards the end of our show, Rod Smith, I want to ask you some questions that I think our listeners will also be interested in. I introduced you as a poet and editor, and also the manager of Bridge Street Books. Bridge Street Books is located at 2814 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest. The store opened in 1980. How long have you been associated with the bookstore?
I was here briefly 88, 89, and left for 3 years to work at Bix Books, which is no longer with us, which was
Oh, yeah, that was in Alice Morgan.
Adams Morgan. And then I came back here. I've been here since 92.
Hmm. When I think of like where Bridge Books is located, I always think of Larry McMurtry,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and
It's the same on the street. Yeah.
right, and just the importance of bookstores. And so, I mean, when I look at you and I look at the bookstore that Rick Peabody tried had opened up on U Street, um, those were stores where you knew that the managers and the owners had a deep love for books and many kinds of deep love for poetry. My question to you, right, is what makes for a good bookstore? Is it location, staff, the actual stock of books, but there has to be some sort of chemistry that takes place to say, okay, this is a good bookstore.
Well, the um, poet Jennifer Moxley, I don't know if she said it or she was quoting a bookseller had said to her, but um, a good bookstore projects taste into the community. something like that is what she said. I think the community makes the bookstore, and the store makes the community, both.
Mhm.
And we're old school in terms of we're not big, and we're focused on trying to have what's considered important in different in different categories, like not just what's new, you know, to to reflect each um, concerns evolution and what remains core to it, you know. So we put new fiction with classics, for example.
Mhm.
You know, you have uh, uh, important philosophy that infected current philosophy as well. You know, you have you know, Shakespeare and Ethelbert Miller are in the same category. You know.
Well, you know that's when you say that, that's one of the key points of in the film that just came out, American Fiction, based
Yeah,
on Percival Everett's book Erasure. You know,
yeah,
okay, why are the black books and the blacks? I mean, it has a lot to do. I guess you just give an example of it of who's managing the store.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and what I also like is, I mean, this had a lot to do with my first introduction to bookstores in New York. I like the small bookstores. I like the bookstores also where there's a sense of discovery. You know, I remember my friend Yao had this Karibu Books in Maryland, right? It was a black bookstore, and I was in there and I was like, but Yao, like, what's Raymond Carver doing in here? Next to Du Bois, and he said, yeah, that's exactly why I put it there. They somebody along with Terry McMillan, whoever was that popular at that time, they would go leave with their Raymond Carver, which I purchased that, but it was that sense of discovery and fun, which is sort of like, I guess I'm looking at the bookstore as well as the library, where or like when I mentioned how I came across the correspondence of Olson and Creeley in the
Mhm,
stacks I found this library at Howard University. That discovery, I find sometimes now with some of the bookstores, especially chain, they're giving me the bestsellers and the books that are moving.
mhm.
Okay, they're not stocking something that I say, oh, I heard about this, but I never read it. So I was wondering also where putting you on the spot. That you go in the store, a really good store, they have the staff's picks. So what are you reading these days, right?
I've been reading a lot of biographies. Read a biography of Kathy Acker, um, the Sonny Rollins biography that
Oh
Aiden
yeah,
Weaver
right, right. He was on the program
wrote.
about several months ago. Yeah, that's the excellent Sonny Rollins biography.
Just started reading biography of Pete Rose.
Oh, okay.
You know,
That's very timely with the gambling situation that we're encountering in terms of sports. I guess Shohei's reading that in Japanese, you know. But
Charlie Hustle.
Jolly Hustle, right? Yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, so you know, I that's the thing about working in a bookstore. You're reading four and five things at a time. You know,
right. Well,
so
how does working in the bookstore help you with your own writing? I think of someone like my friend David Nicholson, who was at one time the editor of book world section of the Post. That sometimes that can be a distraction in terms of all this work is coming in, and then you've got your own work, and how do you keep it original? How do you keep it fresh?
well, I mean, one of the most exciting things is new release day when you know you get to see it, it just feels like an energy that you know things are going on. You
Right.
know, it's not just the canon or whatever
Mm-hmm.
imagination of the canon
Mm-hmm.
each individual might have. It's you thought you knew what was going on, but no, here it is, here it is, here it is, and it's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just that sense of the ongoingness and the creativity.
Mm.
Um,
When you say that, the person that you also remind me of is Rick Simonson up in Seattle, who used to be with Elliott Bay Bookstore, where I loved Elliott Bay, but then you go to his house and he had all the stuff that was the galleys that were coming out,
yeah.
in terms of that. What at the end of that, but what's happening with your magazine? How is what's going on there, Ariel? What's going on with that?
The magazine's maybe done, but Edge Books continues. latest Edge book is a memoir by Bob Rosenthal, who was Allen Ginsberg's secretary for 25 years.
Oh, he must have been before.
He wrote a
Was he?
book just about Allen.
Uh,
There's Allen stuff in here, but this is other
was
things.
he? Was he before Jason Schindler?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So okay, because I knew Jason was like was helping Ginsberg, but I didn't know that. So give us the title of that again.
It's called Fifth Avenue Overhead,
Wow.
Stories
Okay.
of Poetic Survival. He was also very much a part of the St. Mark's scene in New York in the 70s. And in the 80s, he ran incredible international um, poetry festivals, you know, all over New York.
All
And
right.
yeah, he's a really interesting guy.
Well, let me last question, Ross, before I let you go. What's you've been here for a while. What is your state? We had back in January the State of the Union by Biden. What do you feel is the state of American poetry today?
I think it's better than ever. I think something happened maybe 5, 7 years ago that flipped people's ideas about what poetry was changed. It became much more popular and populist and a real sense of possibility. I mean, we have the largest poetry section, many people think, on the East Coast. I don't know if that's true, but certainly we have, 3.5, 4 bookcases of poetry, and we've always done well with it because people search it out. They know that we have it, but it's now a person who buys a novel might also buy poetry, which didn't used to be the case.
Hmm. Well, I think that you are definitely a treasure in our area, and so I want you to continue doing what you do, right, in terms of writing, editing, and keeping Bridge Street Books going. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, my guest today has been Rod Smith, poet, editor, and manager of Bridge Street Books here in DC. He's the editor of the Selected Letters of Robert Creeley with co-editors Peter Baker and Kaplan Harris. The show's On the Margin. My name's Ethelbert Miller. The station is WPFW 89.3 FM.
Is that all right?